This is a lecture I've given on numerous occasions about telephone systems and voice over IP. These are the slides, obviously, and I've decided to add the narration, which is essentially what I would have said if I'd been standing in front of you. It's not a technical talk in the purest sense. It doesn't go into the nitty-gritty of voice over IP. It's more about, first of all, how you can evolve an ordinary telephone system and how I did mine. And secondly, the fun you can have with voice over IP once you've got it. So here we go. Starting off then, what it's really about is the way I developed my home telephone system over about 20 years, perhaps slightly longer. And it turns out that it's rather nice to have some office-like facilities in this, which is fair enough. There's some unusual aspects which might be amusing because they involve victimizing cold callers and things like that. And I'm also talking a little bit about where I might go in the future. Some of it I've now done, as I shall explain. And the whole point is to illustrate the power and flexibility of voice over IP, because once you know that, then you get hooked on it and you can find you can do all sorts of really nice things which you never thought of before. So I hope you enjoy this, and here we go. So I'm going to start off by looking at, just show you the scenario, where why I put this in and what it's for. And then the history, going from what I call the POTS era through Home Highway, which was from up to about 1992. Then we moved on to ISDN and an exchange, and then the voice over IP in two separate phases. Where I am now with the current system, some warnings about security, which is very important. The costs and actually how much it can save you, and then the conclusion. And if I was given this live, I'd be asking for questions. So the scenario is this. Our house is a 5-bedroom house, or nominally 5 bedrooms. In fact, we've turned one of them into a large office, and that's where I'm sitting right now while I record this. 2 floors. It's got 3 reception rooms downstairs, and one of those is now my workshop. For my long-suffering wife, let me do that, as a kitchen, bathroom, and so on. And it was designed really so that we could use the house for a family of 2 adults, 2 children, and we've got a spare room as well. This house is old. It's 1903, and it's an unusual layout. It's quite weird. If you've ever visited here, you'll know that as you go in, you find the conventional 2 rooms to the right of the staircase, and then right at the back you go through into the kitchen. But if you turn left, you go under the stairs and into the living room. And you can't hear people in there if they're calling from upstairs, "It's for you," and things like that. Even in the kitchen, which is a sort of, there's nothing much in between, it's quite hard to hear what people are saying. So it's rather nice if you could have internal phones. And this would apply to any office, of course, where you might want to have a phone on each person's desk. The system's very flexible, and you can do quite a lot with it. So, we moved into this house before this, and I decided I'd rewire the entire house. And it's been rewired for power, for TV cables, burglar alarms, for smoke alarms, and for phones. And every room has got at least one ordinary BT style analog phone socket in it. The living room has got 3. It's got one behind the TV in case we ever wanted a skybox, spit. And it's also got one in each of the other corners where we might have wanted a phone. We were currently using the phone nearest the desk, which is fair enough. And all the lines were taken back to a wiring centre using a large Crone box. If you've ever come across Crone boxes, Crone strips are those things you see on the right there. That's a 301 box, I think. And you can see it's about a foot tall. And it's got 10 Crone strips in it, and they just snap into place. You can buy boxes that take 2 Crone strips. You can buy them that take 100 Crone strips. If you look inside one of those green cabinets in the street, you'll see a large number of these exact Crone strips. That's how they work. BT, I think, bought nearly 30 million of them, of Crone. And the whole point about Crone strips is that you bring your fixed wiring into the bottom of each strip, and your variable wiring, which you might change over time, into the top of each strip. And they just press in. They're what's called insulation displacement connectors. You push the wire in, unstripped, and the sort of little knives catch the wire and pierce through the insulation and make a contact. And you can have Crone strips to do clever things, like they have terminals on one side. You can push pegs into the middle of them to disconnect a circuit. So if I wanted to turn one of the kids' phone off, I could do that, and so on. And it's very easy to reconfigure the thing. And you obviously cross wire between across the strips and between the strips to connect different lines to different functions, different circuits. Each room has also got at least one network socket, which is a gigabit network, gigabit Ethernet, and there are 3 of those in the living room, there are 2 in the workshop, and there's 1 in every other room. And all those cables come back to a rack for the network switches. That's actually right beside this big Chrome box, as it turns out. So the POTS era, that's the first era. That's pretty well ordinary telephone. POTS stands for plain old telephone system. It's what people generally call it. And it's just a conventional landline. So they're on the way out. Initially we had a single landline, and it had one phone socket downstairs and one phone socket upstairs with a rather manky bit of wire joining the two. And I strung an extra wire into one of the rooms, the spare room, so that I could have an interim office while we were doing things. It worked okay, but there's only one actual line, so if you want to answer the phone at night, you had to jump up and either rush into the office or rush downstairs or rush into the bedroom, which actually was going to become an office. And of course, if we were using dial-up internet on that line, so you couldn't use the phone to phone people or to take calls when we were, quote, using the internet, unquote. So that had to go eventually. And the data rate was slow. We were getting about 40 kilobits per second here because we're quite a long way from the exchange. So it wasn't ideal. So then we moved on to Home Highway, which BT offered as a product for some years. Quite a rip-off, really. What they did was they produced there's this thing called Integrated Services Digital Network, which is basically digital services but down an ordinary phone line. And we're talking back in the 1980s even here. And there were 2 sorts. The ordinary one running over an ordinary 2-wire phone line, which had 2 channels on it, and that was called Basic Rate. There was another one whose the rate name I forget now, which cost a lot more, which I think gave you 10 channels. So 2 channels means you can have 2 simultaneous voice calls on it, or 1 voice call and 1 data call up to 64 kilobits per second, or 128 kilobits a second data call. But they would charge you for 2 calls for that, and calls weren't cheap. So it wasn't ideal. This was withdrawn by BT in 2005, 2007, different parts of the country, and I never actually used it past about 2002. I could see the writing on the wall and I got rid of it. Very expensive, charged as dial-up calls, and rather interestingly, it provided with 3 phone numbers. 2 analogue phone numbers for those 2 voice lines, as it were, run over this, and 1 data number. And you can see down on the picture there are 2 analogue connections on the left for the 2 numbers, and strangely 2 data connections. You could use both of those if you wanted, but they're all on the same number. So it was okay as a stopgap, but it clearly wasn't the way forward. So I moved to proper ISDN, which uses the same wires as and technology at the exchange end pretty well as Home Highway, but at the house end you have to have an ISDN phone to plug into it. No normal phone won't work. And it would have been nice to have a proper internal PBX on the proper line, but that's far too expensive. So we had ISDN instead. And ISDN PBXs are still fairly expensive, but I bought one off eBay and it was only about 50 quid. A Cybergear Gold, and you can see it there, a rather strange looking thing. As you can see, it's about 20 centimetres, 8 inches tall, with lots of lights and a rather strange styling. But it did the job, that was the point. And that provided you with 6 internal analogue lines, the sockets in the bottom, and then you just plugged it into the ISDN. It also gave you an Ethernet connection via PPP and dial-up, but we didn't have that for very long. But it was connected to the wiring centre, which was the Chrome box, of course, at that point. What the wiring centre did was connect that to the various phone sockets that we actually wanted to use it with. So we had a choice of where to put the extensions. And you can parallel them up. So, for example, there are 2 sockets in the office, one on each of our desks, my wife and I. And what we did was just connect those 2 together so they rang both. And that worked okay. But it was relatively expensive to rent this thing, and they gave us the wrong number of spare numbers as well. The BT Business in Medway were absolutely useless. It took 3 months to get ISDN installed, and then they did it wrong. And then they said, we'll let you know when we can come and install it, and they just turned up one day without any notice at all. Luckily we were in. So it was just a pain, really, and I just wanted to get rid of BT Business. So I decided that, the other thing was that the PBX, the analog ports would die, and I had to keep buying new. I think I bought 3 different Cybergear Golds in the end. They were getting progressively cheaper as time went on. They were about 30 quid in the end, but even then. So I thought it would be better to try and go for a hybrid analog and voice over IP solution. If I did that, then I wouldn't have to worry about this. So, just to recap about voice over IP, in case you don't know much about it. It uses a network, which is usually the internet, to carry digitized versions of conversations. So it turns everything into binary, effectively digital signals, and sends that across an ordinary computer-type network. And you could have software on your Windows or your Unix machine, which is called an IP soft phone, and that plugs into the network, obviously, because the computer's plugged into the network, and you can talk on the microphone and speakers or headphone on your computer. Or you can use hardware, which is an IP phone, an actual phone, but it doesn't have the conventional wire on it or the conventional plug. It plugs into your computer network. And so you can use either or a mixture. And that works fine, except that, of course, what you're connected to is the internet. You're not connected to, the telephone network. So you need a bit more than that. What you need is something to interface you to the telephone network from the internet. And you pay someone to do that for you, basically. You pay somebody called an ITSP. Notice the extra T in there. Not an internet service provider, an internet telephony service provider. And a lot of ordinary ISPs will provide this. Mine does. So what happens here is that when you make a call, the call goes out to your provider. Your provider will charge you for the call, and the charges are remarkably cheap compared to BT. For example, BT are now charging in excess of 20 pence just to set up a call, unless you've got one of these strange packages they charge. And generally there's no setup charge at all for an ITSP, so it's much, much cheaper. And their actual per minute charges are cheaper, and they're often charged per second, and so on. So your provider will then connect you to the call to the telephone network and do it for you. Now, what happens with incoming calls is they come via the provider. The provider gives you a number, and that's the one you give out to people, and you can take your BT number across, and they're handled by the software or by the phone, and it turns them back into sounds that you can hear. So the ITSP provides you with a phone number, and all calls to that number come through to your ITSP, and your ITSP says, yes, the client who has registered this particular computer, this particular soft phone or hardware IP phone to this number with me, and so I will route the calls to them. One of the nice things is you can route it to multiple IP phones. So you could have one on your laptop, a soft phone, one in your house, and one perhaps even running on your mobile, because you can run voice over IP on your mobile. So you could have the laptop in the south of France and answer your normal home phone calls if you wanted to. Personally, I wouldn't. So this choice is basically we register a device as on that number. You can change that registration whenever you like, just in a few seconds. So you can move around, which is really good. Right. So let's show you my first attempt at voice over IP. I set up a dedicated PC as a voice over IP PBX. PBX stands for Private Branch Exchange, by the way. It's a fairly ancient term. What I use is a rack-mounted mini ITX system, and this is a 1U, which means it's only 1 3/4 inches tall, fits into a computer rack, and mini ITX is a small motherboard, which is 17.5 centimeters square, something like that, and it's got a small motherboard. It doesn't have any fans on the actual motherboard. It's just this great big silver heatsink. You can see the bobbly bit in the top right-hand corner. There are 2 small fans in that casing to the right of that, which turned out to be remarkably noisy, and my hearing isn't all the best now because of that. But it was a nice, cheap, low-power CPU. It had a hard disk, which is currently sitting behind it there, hadn't yet been fitted, and that's it really. So it was a pretty low power system, and I suppose reasonably low noise, but those fans were very small and they whizzed around very fast, and they got quite noisy in the end. And the software you run on this to give yourself a PBX is something called Asterisk, which is an open source telephone system basically. It's just a program you run. You normally run it on a Unix style system, Linux or FreeBSD or something, and it works extremely well. You can get bundled versions of this, which are all set up with nice graphical interfaces and everything else, but you don't really need that, and they can cost money, or you get them pestering you to upgrade to something that costs money. Asterisk works fine. There's some good books on it. The O'Reilly book on Asterisk is very good, and there are several others. There's a lot of online documentation, and it's been around a long time. So the way this works is that Asterisk talks to your ITSP and says, "Oi, if you've got this, if you got any phone calls to this number, send them to me." So Asterisk pretends to be a phone effectively. Doesn't really matter. And it could well be that your ITSP gives you several numbers, and Asterisk can register to take all of those numbers and all of the calls for all of those numbers. And then it knows which one has got a call coming in, so it routes those calls depending on the number. So you could send some calls to a certain set of phones, other calls to another set of phones. Essentially, the phones still have to register to say where they are, what numbers they are. They're now the internal telephone extension numbers, and they tell Asterisk that, and Asterisk knows what to do with each extension. And you can do things, for example, like we have an internal telephone extension for the office, and if you call that via Asterisk, it doesn't even go outside to the ITSP. It just calls both phones that are sitting in the office. But there are other extension numbers which call just one of those phones. So if you know who you want to talk to in the office, you don't have to ring both of them and probably get the wrong person. We have individual phone numbers, as you'll hear later on, and you can route those to a set of phones, which are not necessarily all the phones in the house or all the phones in the office. That's obviously what you want to do as well. So, how does this all communicate with the analog world? Well, what I did with that first attempt at a PBX was I had a PCI card, which is the standard interface card, to plug into the PC. It's not on the picture, and that has got a socket on it to connect with the normal POTS line. And of course, you have to have a POTS line anyway, because that's how you get your ADSL. And this was ADSL in those days, not fibre. That's fine. To do that, you can then keep your ordinary landline connection and feed that through into the PBX as well as any voice over IP calls. And that PCI card was supplied by Digium, who actually, although it's open source, they actually sell Asterisk systems. And it was quite an expensive card. And that port that it's got on it, port, socket, whatever you want to call it, is called an FXO port. This is historical terminology, mainly from the States. In the USA, the name for a telephone exchange was, and in fact still is, I think, the central office. So an FXO port talks to the office, FXO. And then what you have is connected into the network, or into the computer, but connected via the Ethernet network. You have a number of what are called ATAs, analog telephone adapters. These are little boxes which talk to the internal telephones, which of course are all the analog things as well. So if you like, you take an incoming call from over the ordinary landline, it gets digitized in the PCI card, handled by Asterisk in whatever way you like, and then turned back into analog again by the ATAs, which are plugged in somewhere into the network. But the voice over IP calls come in directly digitally. Now, the ATAs, you can buy various ones. I had a very old one supplied by a firm called Sapura. They got taken over by Linksys, and they're now part of Cisco. And they have ports on them called FSX ports. FXS stands for station, and a station is what you and I might call a telephone. I think Cisco call them communication endpoints. They're still telephones. Okay, so this is the Digium PCI card. This is what I had plugged into the PBX, that little rack-mounted PBX PC. It wasn't as smart. Mine didn't have as much on it. What you have there are 4 little vertical cards, 2 red, 2 green, and they work the 4 sockets on the back. And each one of those could be FXS or FXO, and probably something else as well. I only had one of them plugged in, and even that was about 250 quid. But it gives you the idea. You plug that in, and that connects the PBX directly to whatever you want, the external line or to a phone. Here's an 8-port ATA. I had one of these for quite a while, and it ran most of our internal analog lines. It's only about 45 centimeters tall, 4.5 centimeters tall, and from that height you can see that the fan on the left is quite a small one. Again noisy, and it used to wear out. I got fed up with changing that fan. But you plug an Ethernet into it, you plug a load of telephones into it, and off you go. And all that came out of that were cables that just went a short distance and into the big chrome box for distribution around the house. So the problem with that was there was quite a lot of power being used. The PBX was quite noisy, the ATA was noisy, and also the PCI card software was not incredibly reliable, and we used to get it freezing up. So I decided to replace the PC with something else, and I got an HP microserver. HP microservers are interesting. They're quite small. This one is, you can probably tell, that top bay there is one that would normally take a CD or DVD drive. So you can see you can see the USB sockets. So you get an idea of scale. And these are not the current generation. These were just about, I think, to be phased out. What HP seemed to do at the end of the sort of life of one of these things, the sales life, is they discount them, and they also offer cashback. And I bought this for just over £100. In fact, I have to confess I bought 8 of them, and I've got 4 of them sitting beside me here now, one of which is still running, asterisk. The others are running various other things like a mail server and so on. So they've got ample compute power. They're probably overkill. They've got space for 4 disks in there, and a drive or something in the top if you want. But it's good enough. One of these has handled over 10 phone calls at the same time with no difficulty. But you could go for something a lot cheaper. You could use a Raspberry Pi even, although you then have a few other problems in terms of perhaps keeping it cool and getting enough connections to it and so on. The Digium card wouldn't fit the microserver, and I was getting fed up with the Digium card. It was unreliable. So I decided to replace that with the another ATA. The Digium card was only used to connect to the outside world via the landline, and I could have just dumped the landline number, I guess, but I didn't. I had an SPA 3102 anyway, which is a Linksys stroke Cisco thing, and it's got one FXO line on it and one FXS. So the FXS you can use to connect to the outside line. It's got Ethernet, which you can plug into the asterisk box, and off you go. And it also allowed me to run one analog phone line internally if I wanted to. I actually use that for a bell. More about that later on. And it decouples all the phone connection from the actual server. So if I need to change the server because there's a fault, I can simply unplug the server from the network and put a new one in, and off it goes. Change the disks over. And that actually happened once. The server started smouldering. There was a bad connection, power connection inside to using a third-party cable, which was not of good quality. But I was able to change it and have the thing running again in half an hour. So that's SPA 3102, nice little box. I don't use it anymore, but it was very good. It's got all the necessary connections. Off you go. So then phase 3. I'd now had 3 ATAs. I had the SPA 8000 giving me 8 FXS ports for internal lines. The SPA 2000, which I'd bought many years before to evaluate asterisk in the first place, with 2 more ports on it. And the 3102, which had one of each for the external line and for a spare FXS port. So I removed the first 2 to reduce noise and power consumption, particularly with the SPA 8000, which got incredibly hot. And I wanted to use some more intelligent phones than those. So I replaced all the internal phones, and I replaced them with hardware IP phones. These are proper phones that plug directly into the network. This wasn't really a problem because, yes, I know I had phone sockets all around the house, but I had Ethernet sockets all around the house, and usually they were right next to the phone sockets because I did them all at the same time. So no problem. And I kept that ATA, the last one, not for the external line, but for the internal line, which is basically going out to the bell, as you'll see. So I didn't really use the landline anymore. And I chose Cisco products again because these Cisco products are actually, they're previously Supura products, had the same interface in terms of programming on the web as the ATAs did pretty well. So they were very familiar. And they're also easy to configure via an XML file. You can set up a file in XML. For those of you who don't know, XML is a simple language layout. It looks a bit like HTML. And it allows you to generate a complete configuration in XML in advance. And I've got a little program to do that. And it sets up the entire configuration for that particular phone, and then you just load it into the phone over the network. So it's very, very easy to configure. I bought the cheaper SPA 301 for 3 of the locations. One of those is actually currently spare, I'm not using anymore. But there's one in the kitchen on the wall where there isn't much room for anything else. And we don't use it that much. And there's one in my workshop, again on the wall in the corner, because the rest of the walls in the workshop are covered with shelves and equipment, and there isn't really any room. And the rest of them are the SPA 303, which is a much more sophisticated device. As you can see, it's got a screen, so you get caller ID, you've got all sorts of buttons for turning things off and on, and you can put a wireless adapter in a little socket slot in the back. The soft keys, the 4 below the screen, you can program to do whatever you want. And I've got mine programmed at the moment to do redial and last number recall, and then a couple of hotkeys for the places I'm likely to call most often. So it's actually quite good. And it's got a 2-port Ethernet switch built into it. So one of the ports obviously goes directly into the phone itself, but it means you can plug the phone into a socket on the wall and then plug something else into the phone, which can be quite useful. And I think the obvious reason for that was that they were going to have people using them in their offices, and you might want to plug your PC in as well as the phone into a single socket. So you could upgrade to IP phones without having to rewire the office. So once I got all this done, I got my ITSP to provide me with a block of 10 consecutive numbers for the Canterbury area beginning 01227. I'm actually using 8 of those, and one is a general house number, so if you ring that, all the phones in the house ring perfectly normally. There are 4 personal numbers for each family member. There's one for the memo service, I'll talk about that, one for the remote door unlocking, and one for the 3G shed alarms. You now begin to see that these sort of things you can do with this stuff. This isn't limited to just phones. Perhaps we don't use wired phones that much these days, but this is where they come in really useful. And you can integrate them with mobiles as well. So internal calls ring with a single ring cadence, sort of as you might expect, and you can phone any phone from any other phone and so on. If you phone certain numbers, they might ring more than one other phone. The house number rings with a normal cadence of doop 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 doop. The sort of thing you get on an ordinary phone. The 4 personal numbers ring with a cadence which is set up. Well, I had to make them personal, and this is very, very sad, but it's true. I made them equivalent to the Morse code for the individual's initial. So mine is a long and 3 shorts for B, and nobody calls me Robert. Nobody. The shed alarms ring with a cadence which is 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, SOS. And the other 2 numbers actually never need to cause a phone to ring, so they don't. So you can see there that these numbers have a variety of uses. And there's one more cadence used for another purpose, which I'll come to later on. Okay, so the system runs on an HP microserver. It's the same HP microserver. This runs the FreeBSD operating system because I'm used to FreeBSD. I know most people use Linux, but it runs equally well on here. It runs the Asterisk PBX software, which is currently Asterisk 13. I think it might be 14 now, I can't remember. The hardware is one SPA3102, the FXS FXO adapter, which is just there to run that bell on the right. 3 SPA301 IP phones I showed you earlier, 7 SPA303s, the big ones. One external line, which is only used now for the broadband, but we've still got the POTS line on it. One BT Bell 80D as it's called, which is a fairly substantial bell, probably about 15 centimetres across, and that's in the garden. We've obviously got the gigabit network and 1 or 2 bits of custom built hardware. I'll come to that in a minute because the custom built hardware is not sophisticated, but it does some interesting things. So Asterisk is a very flexible system. What's good about this whole voice over IP thing is that the Asterisk box is an easy thing to put together. It's very extensible, and when you get it, it's got all sorts of useful stuff built in already. But then you can add scripts. You can connect any extension number you like, including imaginary ones, to a script and make it do really odd things. So these are some of the things I've done. I've got textual caller ID. So on the SPA303 phones, the ones with a screen, it has a database which you can easily update of all the common numbers that call us, and that database contains a textual representation of them, so you know who they are. It could be somebody's name, it could be a company name, whatever. So you can see instantly who's calling without having to think whose number is that. It's got voicemail. Well, voicemail sort of comes with it, and rather nicely, these phones have got a light on them on the top of the phone. If you flip back later on, you can have a look at the top of the phone. There's a little thing along the top, little sort of clear bit of plastic, and that lights up red whenever there's voicemail connected to that phone. You can decide which phones are going to have that light go on it, depending on the particular number that rang. So voicemail for me only lights up the phone in the office, in fact, beside my desk, because that's how I like it. Shortcode dialing. A lot of people like to set up buttons on their phones to dial numbers they use regularly. And that's fine, but it's a real pain when you've got to do that for all the phones in the house whenever you change one of the buttons. And if you don't keep all the buttons the same, then people get very confused. Also, depending on whose phone it is, you might want different buttons to do different things. So you don't want any of that really. So forget about the buttons, have shortcodes. The shortcodes are 3-digit numbers, beginning with 3 in our case. And when you dial one of those 3-digit numbers, it will look up in its database and dial a particular number. And we have something like, I'm just looking now, I've got about 50 shortcodes set up, and all beginning with a 3, and that is from things like the police non-emergency, NHS Direct, because that was changing number at one time, the vet, the doctor, restaurants, takeaways, you name it. You can record calls. You just hit a key or 2 keys and it will start recording the phone call. And of course that's useful if you're phoning up somebody like, as we were phoning up a council to get an elderly relative house that was had a problem with the electrics, get the council out of hours. And we threatened them. We said, we are recording this call, so if anything goes wrong tonight, it's going to be your fault. And we can prove it. Selective ringing, depending on the number you call that's being called at the time of day. So we've got all these different numbers and incoming calls. Obviously, we want to have them ring differently, and I've said that already. The Morse code stuff and so on. But also the time of day could be brought into it. But for example, our son's numbers were set up to ring their room only first. If they were getting an incoming call, we didn't want to be bothered with that. So it would ring for 6 times in their room, and then it would tell the caller we are now trying the rest of the house, and then ring the rest of the house with that same cadence. So that saved us a bit of hassle. Caller blacklisting. Well, obviously very useful. I've got quite a long blacklist now. If somebody rings my mobile or any of our phones and says, they're trying to sell you something or whatever, it doesn't happen very often. or there are people you just do not want to talk to at all, then you put them into the blacklist. And they get a very terse message that says, you are blacklisted. It hangs up. That's really good. Then there's caller grey listing, which is evil and something I put in myself with a script. What happens here is this is for somebody you'd rather not speak to, but you don't want to offend outright. We have a few of those. I won't say any more in this recording. But what the caller hears is several rings, and then they're sent straight to voicemail every time. They can't get through. They don't know. They can't hear any different to the to ringing us and there being nobody answering and then being sent to voicemail. They can't tell that they're grey listed. And of course, during all this, no phones are actually rung anywhere in the house, so we're not even bothered by that. So I rather like that. Call parking. You can park a call. You can leave a caller on hold with hold music. You just dial a number, a short number, 700 in fact. And that means if you're talking to somebody, you can dial 700, hang the phone up, and then walk to another phone, perhaps in a private room or upstairs in the office or whatever, and dial a number that it tells you before you hang up, usually 701 or 702, and it picks up the appropriate call for the parking space, and you can carry on where you left off. Call pickup. If I hear the phone ringing in another room, but it's only ringing in that room because it's a call that's not normally directed to me, I can pick it up by dialing 200, and the two numbers are all the internal phone numbers. So 200 is a special internal phone number. Pick up the ringing extension. Internal paging. I put this in too because I thought this was quite useful. If I don't know where somebody else is in the house, and I'm right up in the top far corner of the house in the office where I'm sitting now, I don't want to be bothered with ringing different phones. So what I do is I ring a number beginning with 401, 402, 403, 404 for the four of us, and it rings all the phones in the house with that special cadence, apart from the phones in the room I'm in, obviously, or nearby. And that means that wherever they are in the house, they'll hear it and they'll pick it up. And there's a speaking clock. At one point in the dim and distant past, my sons thought the speaking clock was great fun, and they would dial 123. At 45 pence a throw from BT, this got expensive, so this actually overrides the external 123. He picks it up first, and it actually does get the right time. It uses the time of the time on the Unix system that it's running on, and that's synchronised using NTP, so it's very accurate. So that's fine. Next thing it does is least cost routing. In fact, there's not so much of this as there was, but it tries to minimise the cost of calls. Again, you can script this to do lots of clever things. So most calls are now routed via voice over IP, to be honest. So, and voice over IP is about the cheapest way, but some calls still have to be routed via BT, things like 999 and so on. It's quicker to do that. But in fact, I've now stopped that altogether, in fact, because I no longer have a BT line. But you can do that. Certain numbers are blocked completely, because if you ring things like anything beginning with 070, for example, it looks like a mobile phone number, but 070s are personal numbers, and they're very expensive to call. 09 numbers, of course, the premium ones, mainly porn, they're also expensive. I don't know who might use those, so that's also blocked. Obviously, this PBX doesn't just handle one call, it can handle many calls. So I can pick up the phone and everyone else in the house can pick up a phone. We can all make outgoing calls, or we can talk to each other, and it doesn't matter. That all works fine. And of course, incoming calls are the same. We can take more than one incoming call. Now, additional features. I mentioned the memo service. There's an external number that doesn't ring at all. It simply takes a message and emails it to a list of people, in fact. When I'm away from home, perhaps driving up the motorway, and I think of something I've got to do or suddenly remember something, I can simply ring the memo service from the car, hands-free of course, so that I've got voice-operated calls, and then I can just say whatever it is that's on my mind. And when I get home eventually, or I log in, I can find a voice file with whatever I've intoned being played back to me. It gets emailed as an attachment. But I even use that at home. If I'm in the kitchen and I think of something I've got to do when I go out shopping, or whatever, or when I get upstairs even, I can just dial a particular internal number which does the same thing, 130, and it'll record something. So it works really well. The doorbell. Now this is something which I was quite proud of actually. The problem with the doorbell is that one couldn't easily hear it everywhere in the house. It's quite hard to hear it in some parts of the house. And if you're doing something in the back garden, it's pretty well impossible. If you add that to the fact that you've got people like Parcel Force delivering, we all know that Parcel Force delivery drivers are largely those people who, when they were a little boy, used to ring the doorbell and run away. And it's not just Parcel Force; it's also Yodel and one or two others. So having the doorbell clearly audible the first time, then that is the thing to do. So the bell push on the front door is connected to an Arduino, which is a microcontroller, which sends a message via a USB connection to a little process that's running on the PBX. And that then cues an immediate call to all the extensions with another cadence, which is a very urgent one. It's 6 sharp bursts followed by 6 sharp bursts. And that means that you can pretty well hear the phone anywhere in the house. And that works pretty well, actually. The only disadvantage I've found is that it's not audible outside the house. So I'm going to actually make the PBX do something else as well. It's going to play something through a speaker which is mounted in the glass above the front door. I'm probably going to have Westminster chimes or something, or a submarine klaxon, or whatever I feel like, or just a voice saying, "Your doorbell push has been noted. Please wait." You can imagine that. The only problem we found with the doorbell is that, yes, it's really audible now, but our son's had a habit of coming home very late at night and then ordering a takeaway. So, at 1:30 in the morning, we get a ring at the doorbell with the takeaway, and we weren't happy with that because it would wake us up in the bedroom. So you can now enter a code on any phone, and it basically turns off the ringer. The phone's ringing, the doorbell ring, in selected rooms, basically the bedrooms where we're sleeping or a guest is sleeping. They'll carry on ringing everywhere else, but they won't ring in those rooms. And that's quite nice. And you just dial *65 and it will hush the bell for half an hour, or *65 followed by a number of minutes, and it will hush it for that number of minutes. And that's quite useful, as long as sons, they'd be very good actually. They have actually remembered to use the hushing when they order a takeaway. They order the takeaway and then they immediately dial this afterwards, and it turns off our phone rather than theirs. So we don't have to be involved. We could already be asleep by that time. Call recording, as I've mentioned, that you just dial #3 and it starts recording from that point. Access to the recording isn't marvellous at the moment, but we're working on that. Okay, now the next one's a door lock. This was again started because of sons coming home late. They would come home from work and they would go down the takeaway and then arrive home about 1:30 in the morning, and then discover they'd forgotten their keys. Not happy. So I decided the best thing to do would be to be able to unlock the front door from the bedside. So there's a little relay which feeds power to the front door, and the door lock has got one of those special hasps on it which you can run with it's a solenoid operated hasp. The sort of thing you have in flats, when you want to let somebody in the front door. And it's plugged by USB into the PBX again, and once you've got that, a script can run it. And if you dial 666, carefully chosen internal extension number, then it will unlock the front door for 10 seconds and makes a buzzing noise outside. Then I sort of extended that because the door can also be unlocked via an external call. You can make a call to one particular landline number, the Canterbury number, and it will ask you for 2 different bits of authentication. So it's pretty secure. Frankly, if somebody wanted to break in that badly, they could use a crowbar on the front door. And that is great because we can let them in if we wanted to at 1:30 in the morning or whatever. It's also good if somebody's locked themselves out and we are some distance away from home. We can use a mobile phone to do it. Indeed, they can as well. If they remember all the numbers, which are not difficult, then they can get themselves into the house. One of my sons actually went out to get something from the car, locked himself out, and then found his brother was so fast asleep after work that he couldn't wake him. He rang us. We were in Brighton at the time, and I was just about to unlock from there, and I think he actually managed it himself. And before you worry about all this going wrong, as my wife did at first, remember you still have that flat bit of metal that you can place into a slot in the door and rotate. That will still actually get the door open. So this is an adjunct to that. Right, now we go on to call filtering. Well, this is the good bit actually, and possibly the most useful for most people. Anyone who doesn't give their caller ID doesn't just get straight through. I know a lot of people won't even answer calls that don't give caller ID, but that can sometimes cause you problems. So mine are quite fun. I've got, first of all, a menu. They have to go through a menu, and they record the call for future emailing to me so I can laugh at it. And the last option lets the caller through. So if they persist, even a salesman can get through. And this has worked well with the hospital and with the doctor, and they're quite happy with that kind of arrangement. But before the menu starts, what's sent out first is what's called a special information tone, which is the do-do-do tritone, which basically means this line is not working. And that knocks off most of the automated dialers that will dial before they even put a person on the line. So that works quite well. Alarm calls, this was something which has turned out to be incredibly useful. On any extension you can book an alarm call. You dial 125 and then a 4-digit number, which is the time. And it will then repeat the time back to you that it thinks it is. And then at that time the extension will ring for a fixed time or until answered. It actually has several goes. It stops, waits a bit, tries again, waits a bit, tries again. So it's quite a good way of having alarm calls. And if you've got the privileged access code, you can use a different number to actually set an alarm call on any other extension. Occasionally done that for sons when they've forgotten to set an alarm. There's an external bell in the guard, as I mentioned, and it's connected to the SPA3102 because it's a conventional analog type bell. It's a bell without a phone. And that's connected up so that it rings when the doorbell rings and when incoming calls ring. So you can tell if there's a phone call in the garden. You can't answer it from an outside phone, but that's fine. But it does tell you the doorbell's going, so you can hear the parcel force man from the back garden. You can hear people coming to the Barbie when you're having a Barbie in the back garden. But it doesn't go off all the time. It only goes off when you want it to, because otherwise the neighbours will get a bit fed up. So you dial *61 and it goes on. You can dial *60 to turn it off again, but at 8 PM it will go off anyway. That's automatic, just to make sure in case you've forgotten. So they're again really useful additions which you wouldn't get with an ordinary phone system, but you do get when you use a voice over IP system like this. Okay, well let's move on to other stuff. That's all the fun stuff, if you like, for the moment. But I've pretty well gone on to exclusive voice over IP now. Since I wrote these slides, I've moved a bit further, and I have actually now moved the line from BT to another provider, which is my ITSP, which is also my ISP. The SPA3102 is hard to get hold of these days, and in a fresh installation you wouldn't use it. There are apparently some Chinese knockoffs of it available on eBay, but I tried to buy one and I just got fleeced out of the money, so I don't know. The current rental for a BT line is, when I last looked, was £219.84 for a year, and that's with limited free calls at weekends only. If you want unlimited national calls, for some value of unlimited, because they tell you there's a fair usage, and it's extra £119.88, so it's a lot of money per year for getting your free calls. The ITSP line rental is less than £150 per annum, and that includes VAT. That doesn't include calls, but BT call charges are typically 15p a minute and a 23p call setup fee, even more to a mobile. I'm paying 2p a minute to all destinations with no setup fee, and would you believe it, they charge per second after the first minute. So it's incredibly good value compared to BT. And you don't get all the nasty calls from BT who keep telling you, would you like our broadband, and so on. So, international calls show much greater savings actually. BT are real rip-offs for international calls. They could be really, really cheap on voice over IP as well. In fact, there's a certain class of voice over IP calls which don't use numbers. I won't get into that, but they are actually free. Last thing to say is security. If you're going to set up one of these PBXs for yourself, then it's going to be exposed to the outside world. It's got to be to work. You need to try and make sure that people don't make calls through your PBX and onto your phone bill. People will try to hack you. They try to hack mine all the time, but it gets logged, it gets blocked, everything else. And what they're trying to do is find a way of getting free outgoing access. Your internal extensions have to be set up as the only things that can make outgoing calls, and you have to fix it so it can't bridge calls to those internal extensions. But that, yeah, okay, there's some more fun bits now. Now there are some wonderful scripts you can get ready-made, but you can make your own, of course, that do horrible things to people like telemarketers. And there are scripts available that wait for caller silence, for example, and then they say innocuous things that then prod the caller into saying something else. And these have been known to keep junk callers occupied for some time, 20 minutes I've heard. So there'll just be something like, yes I see. Can you tell me more? I don't know. And so on. So you can really, really toy with people in a big way. There are also a lot longer sound files that can tie callers up. And this sound file is a minute or two long, but it's worth hearing because it's just so funny. I don't actually have this sound file in the system to use, but I think it's worth hearing. So here we are.
Thank you for holding. Your patience is appreciated. You're the next caller in line. Your patience while on hold is appreciated. We know your time is valuable. You will be helped by the next available representative. Thanks again for holding. We are currently giving another customer the same care and attention that we look forward to giving to you soon. We appreciate you holding for just a moment more. Your patience is appreciated, and we value your business. Please stay on hold for just a moment more. You are the next... You know what? I'm sorry. I have to be honest with you. You are not the next caller in line. I'm sorry. I can't do this anymore. You know what? Can I tell you something? You are so far down the call queue right now that it is actually very likely that we won't answer your call anytime today. There, I've said it. There are so many people ahead of you right now that the next human voice that you'll hear on this phone line is probably the cleaning lady at 11:30 tonight, noticing the receiver's off the hook. Yeah, and she'll pick it up and she'll say hello, and that's the best we're going to be able to do for you today. Listen to me, and I'm not supposed to be telling you this, okay? Hang up now. Live your life. Spend time with your children. Go outside. Daydream. Eat good fruit. Anything but staying in this infernal on-hold queue. Your patience is appreciated more than you'll know. But you will never, and I mean never, be helped by the next available representative. Hang up now. You are not the next caller in line.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that. You can see there also that there is some stuff for the menu system. When somebody calls and withholds their caller ID, if you are a telemarketer, press 1, and they get something along the lines of if the household, everyone in the household is busy assisting other telemarketers, please hold. If we want a holiday, press 2, and they say, what do you take us for, and so on. So there's a lot of interesting things you can do. Okay, well that's nearly over. I know it's over the top for a house, possibly very sad, but it's all useful stuff really. It's great fun and really requires very little in the way of maintenance long term. It may or may not save you money overall, but I think it's worth it. And I really enjoy using it. So there we are. You don't need a very powerful system. People run it on a Raspberry Pi. Obviously, if you want to have sound and everything else, and you want to do other things, then you might want to have a few more. You can try it all out without actually compromising your existing telephone system. Just get a number for an ITSP, and there are many of those around. Your ITSP your ISP might offer this, but there's VoIP Cheap and a few others. You just go and look them up. And you need some hardware. You don't even need hardware really, because the hardware you can use is your laptop, PC, just a soft phone application. I would recommend something called Zoiper, which works fine for just a single phone. So install Zoiper on your PC, get an ITSP number, set it up to authenticate via your ITSP, and off you go, and you can make calls. It really works. Okay, well, I would normally ask the questions at this point, but this is a recording. What I would say is that if you want to leave any questions, either on YouTube if you're seeing this there, or elsewhere via my website, then feel free to do so. So, thanks for listening and sort of watching, but not me. You wouldn't want that. And goodbye.